Well, let me lower your blood pressure just a little bit. I understand that for some of you right now, life's not really going too well. And I understand for some of you in this room that things really aren't working out for you the way you thought they might be at this stage of your life. And you may be resenting the fact that I'm calling on you to be joyful. And so let me just kind of make everybody feel better by making everybody feel bad. The question is not, are you going to have bad days? We all have bad days. Bad weeks, bad months, bad years, get bad news. That is not the question. The question is, when you do, how are you going to respond? How are you going to handle it? Now, the Lord's half-brother James gave this piece of advice. You think I've already got you riled up. Listen to what he said. He said, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Now, how about that? You know, he would say, you know what the world would say, consider it bad luck when you encounter all kinds of trials. James says, oh no. When the bad news comes, when the bad days hit, consider it pure joy. You say, how on earth can any whack job say that? How can anybody expect that? How can anybody command that? Now, I want you to understand before I really get into this message, some of you have already confused what I'm talking about because you think I'm talking about one thing and I'm talking about something else. I am not talking about happiness. I'm talking about joy. Big difference between happiness and joy. Being full of joy and being happy are not the same thing. Big differences. For example, happiness is external. Joy is internal. Happiness is based on chance. If something good happens, I'm happy. If something bad's happened, I'm unhappy. No, joy is based on choice. Happiness depends upon circumstances. Joy depends upon Christ. Now, the question is, and I want to answer this morning, okay, how do you become joyful? And not only that, how do you stay joyful 24/7? How do you do that? How in the world can you be joyful on the inside when everything's falling apart on the outside? I want you to write this down. This is what I want you to take out the door. Once I choose Christ, I can always choose joy. Once I choose Christ, I can always choose joy. You say, how do you do that? Well, in John's Gospel, we're going to learn because Jesus tells us how we can be joyful and what joy will look like when we are. Now, if you're one of these people, and I hope you fall in this category, if you say, you know what, I'm going to make up my mind today. I would rather go through life joyful than miserable. Now, I'll be honest with you, some of you are not there. Some of you get great joy out of being miserable. And some of you get great joy out of making other people miserable with you. But maybe you're here this morning and you say, you know what? I really would rather go through life joyful than miserable. I would really rather go through life with a smile on my heart than a frown on my face. Then Jesus said, here's what you need to do. 3 simple things. And they're difficult, but they're really not hard. First thing Jesus said you got to do is you got to decide to be joyful. Now, in John chapter 16, let me give you the background of these verses. John 16, verse 16, we're going to read 4 verses. Jesus is about to go to the cross. The disciples don't know this yet. He keeps telling them, but they don't really get it. But he's about to go to the cross, and even though the disciples didn't know it, he's really trying to get them ready for an event that he knows is going to suck all the joy out of their life. Now, here's how he sets it up. John 16, verse 16. He said, in a little while, you'll see me no more, and then after a little while, you'll see me. Some of his disciples said to one another, what does he mean by saying in a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you'll see me, and because I'm going to the Father? They kept asking, what does he mean by a little while? We don't understand what he's saying. Jesus saw that they wanted to ask him about this, so he said to them, are you asking one another what I meant when I said a little while you'll see me no more, and then after a little while you'll see me? He says, very truly, I tell you, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. Now, Jesus was obviously talking about 2 different events. He was talking about the crucifixion, and he was talking about the resurrection. But the first thing he said, let me talk about my death. In a little while, you're not going to see me. What he meant by that is, in just a little while, I'm going to die. And when I do, for the first time, something's going to happen that hasn't happened to you in 3 years. You're going to be completely without me. I'm not going to be there to hold your hand. I'm not going to be there to pull your boat out of the storm. I'm not going to be there to feed your hungry people. I'm not going to be there to raise your kids from the dead. I'm not going to be there to heal your fever. You're not going to have me for 3 solid days. It's going to seem like 3 years, but I am not going to be with you, because the unthinkable is going to happen. Because you have to understand, Jesus, if you remember in the Gospels, more than one time, he keeps trying to get the disciples to understand, I'm going to die. And if you remember, Peter was the ringleader, and he kept saying to him, no, you're not. Because Messiahs don't die, and we believe you're the Messiah. Sons of God don't die, and we believe you are the Son of God. So sorry, you got it wrong. That's not going to happen. But Jesus teaches us that nobody, not even the Son of God, is immune to sorrow and suffering. Bad things happen to good people, and terrible things happen to God's people. It just does. Then Jesus tells us, though, joy overcomes sorrow. Look what he says again in verse 20. Very truly I tell you, you will weep, and you will mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. Now that's an amazing statement. Jesus said, look, there are going to be times in your life, even if you decide to love God and follow God and serve God and worship God, there are going to be times you're going to be bawling your eyes out while the world's laughing their eyes out. There's going to be times when you can't stop the tears from flowing while the world can't stop themselves from laughing. But even in the midst of your grief, I'm going to make a promise to you, your grief will turn to joy. And here's what Jesus was saying was this. You can decide to be joyful even in the midst of deep sorrow. Even in the most trying, difficult time of your life, you can decide in God and through God, I am going to be joyful. Now you say, Pastor, that's what I just don't believe. I don't buy it. I don't get that. Then Jesus proves how it can happen. Look what he says in verse 21. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into this world. Now, I've had the privilege, and I hope a lot of you had, but I had the privilege all 3 times of being in the delivery room when my 3 sons were born. And quite frankly, I can tell you that for my wife, it was a very painful experience. Didn't hurt me. Even though the pain was excruciating and sometimes the labor was a little bit difficult, something happened every single time. Whenever the doctor brought that little boy, James first, then Jonathan, then Joshua, whenever that doctor brought that little boy out of that womb, you know what happened to her? All the pain she forgot about. And what happened was the joy overcame the sorrow. And what Jesus was saying was, there's only one way you can maintain joy in your life when those tough, hard, gut-wrenching times come into your life. And that's when you make up your mind, in the middle of that trouble, I am not going to focus on the trouble. I'm going to focus on God. I'm not going to keep my eye on what's happening to me. I'm going to keep my eye on who is over what is happening to me. Because let me tell you something. There are all kinds of joy stealers out there. I got news for you. All kinds of. I'll just give you 3. And some of you are fighting these right now. One joy stealer is undeserved guilt. That sneaky thief will slide into your thoughts and mind. I mean, you'll just be right along in the car, and all of a sudden you'll remember something you did you shouldn't have done as a kid or a teenager back when you were in college. And all of a sudden these just waves of guilt will just wash over you. Before you know it, your joy's gone. Another joy is uncertain consequences. You got this fear. You're in a circumstance right now, and you're wondering, how am I going to get out of this? How am I going to solve this problem? How am I going to pay this bill? And I mean, the pressure of the moment right now is just excruciating. And all of a sudden your joy's gone. And another joy stealer is an undetermined future. You're anxious over what might happen tomorrow. Hey, the doctor's going to get my blood work back tomorrow. Will it be good or will it be bad? Is there a spot on the X-ray or not a spot on the X-ray? Am I going to hear from my doctor tomorrow? Or am I going to lose my job? I've heard they may have a layoff. And you got all kinds, and they rob your joy. And I want you to tell you, I want to listen. When you're in that situation in your life, and one of those things are stealing your joy, the guilt, or the present, the past, the present, the future, I want you to remember this. You remember that your past has already been forgiven by a merciful God. And you remember that your present is already being controlled by a sovereign God. And you remember that your future has been guaranteed by a loving God. And when you remember all 3 of those things, then you can say to yourself, man, I can be joyful even in the midst of all this. There's a great verse in Hebrews, and you probably hadn't read it in a long time or probably have never memorized it. It'd be a great verse to memorize. But there's a great verse in Hebrews that talks about when Jesus was about to go to the cross. And in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, now he's about to face the greatest pain, greatest suffering anybody's ever experienced. And in Hebrews 12:2, listen to what we read. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, for the joy set before him. Watch this. He endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Now, I want to ask you a question. How could Jesus endure the pain and the suffering and the heartache of being completely, totally separated from God that he had known for all eternity? How could he do that with joy? Because he focused on the joy of knowing that as a result of his death, my Father's going to be glorified, my people are going to be redeemed, sins are going to be forgiven, and this world is going to be made right. Sorrow is like cold air. And when sorrow and suffering and heartache and pain comes into your life, if you've really made up your mind in that moment, I'm going to focus on God, the cold air of sorrow will kick on the furnace of joy in your heart. It will just happen. And what will happen is people will see in your life that even though you're going through this incredibly difficult time, you've got this unshakable confidence in God's purpose and God's power and God's presence and God's providence, even in the midst of your suffering. So you can make up your mind sitting in that chair right now. You know what? I'm going to decide today. I'm going to be joyful. And Jesus said, if you'll take the first step, you'll automatically then want to take the second step. And that is, you've got a desire to be joyful. Now, I want to prove to you how you can do this. Because you may be sitting there and saying, well, you just can't desire it. Well, sure you can. I'll prove it to you. Some of you are going to go out to eat today after church. You're going to go to a restaurant. When you go to a restaurant, the food, I can tell you what food you're going to order. You're going to order food you enjoy. And that's, we order food and we drink certain beverages because we enjoy them. We buy things and we build things because we think they will bring us joy. Now my question is, where does the desire to have joy come from? Well, where did we get that desire? Well, it's very plain. It comes from God. And if you want to be joyful, you've got to ask God to be joyful, because joy is a choice. And I want to show you how you can choose to be joyful, because I want you to understand this. I'm not telling you that you got to somehow manufacture this joy. It's not like you just strange, okay, I'm going to be joyful. If it kills me, I'm going to be. That's not what I'm talking about. Joy is not something you manufacture from within. It's something that God gives you and that you receive from God. I know you may think I'm crazy. And I know you're sitting there saying, well, you can't choose joy. Nobody can choose joy. Listen again to what Jesus said in John 15, verse 11. He says, I have told you this, so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. Jesus said, look, joy is a gift. And what he's saying is, I want to give you my joy, so that your joy may be complete. Every morning when you get out of bed, you have the right and you have the ability literally to pray this prayer. You can get up every morning before you get out of bed. You can say, Lord, today, would you give me your joy? And would you make my joy complete? You say, how do you know you can do that? Real simple. Jesus said in the Lord's Prayer, one of the things we can ask God for every day is our daily bread. Well, if you can ask God for bread, you can ask God for joy. And every morning when you get up, if you want to, you can say, God, today I am specifically asking you to give me your joy. Now, let me tell you the hard truth, okay? And some of you sour pusses out there just need to hear what I'm going to tell you. And you know who you are. If you don't want to be joyful, you won't be. If you get up in the morning and say, I choose not to be joyful, you won't be joyful. And if you don't choose to be joyful, you can't be joyful. And if you can't be joyful, you won't be joyful. On the other hand, if you want to be joyful, you will be joyful. If you choose to be joyful, you can be joyful. And if you can be, you will be. But you've got to choose to be. And the bottom line for every follower of Jesus Christ is this. I've already said it. Once I choose Christ, I can always choose to be joyful. Always. That's exactly what the Apostle Paul meant in Philippians 4:4. Rejoice in the Lord. What's that next word? Always. But the economy's bad. But my 401k is down. But the x-ray came out bad. My blood work is terrible. My wife just walked out. Rejoice in the Lord. Always, again, I will say rejoice. No, you can't always rejoice in your circumstances. I get that. You can't always rejoice in the economy. You can't always rejoice in your 401k. You can't always rejoice in your bank account. You can't always rejoice in your blood work. I get all that. But you can always rejoice in the God who's over all that stuff. So you can decide to be joyful. You can desire to be joyful. And then one last thing Jesus said, you can determine to be joyful. You can determine it. Now I want you to understand, I use that word determine on purpose. You don't determine with your feelings, you determine with your will. See, happiness is a feeling. Let me help you with something. Whoever said, don't worry, be happy, is a whack job. That guy's a whack job. I mean, can I tell you something? If I went to my doctor, if I went to Dr. Gazaway tomorrow and I went in and I said, Dr. Gazaway, I feel terrible. Well, what's wrong? And he took my temperature. I had a 103-degree fever, blood pressure's elevated, runny nose, red eyes, shaking like a leaf. If all my doctor did was look at me and say, feel better. Are you kidding me? That's all you got? That's the only bullet you got in your gun? Feel better? I mean, can you imagine coming to see me as your pastor? Man, I'm depressed. Well, feel happy. Bye-bye. Have a good day. I mean, that's crazy. But joy is different. The word for joy, used 74 times in the New Testament, it represents, listen, a delight in the heart that is based on spiritual realities. So let me ask you a question, and it's a fair question, and you have a right to the answer. Why must a true Christ follower be joyful? Not why can you be, not why should you be. I'm asking this question. Why must you be if you are a true follower of Jesus Christ? Let me tell you why. Let me tell you why if you're a true follower of Jesus Christ, you can't help but be joyful. You can't help it. The reason is because God is joyful. And if you're full of God, you'll be full of joy. It's just that simple. God's joyful. And if you're full of God, you'll be joyful. Now, I know most of us didn't grow up with the idea of God being a joyful God. I know some of us grew up in one of these churches where the favorite topic was hell. And you grew up and you've got this idea that God is sitting up on his throne with a lightning bolt in his right hand, and he just loves to zap people and get out of line. That's what he does all day long. Gotcha! And that's what you think. Well, I want you to listen to how God is described in a book that I bet most of you have maybe never read or hadn't read in a long time. It's an ancient book called Zephaniah. And in Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 17, listen to what the Bible says. Listen, this is unbelievable. The Lord your God is with you. Let me just stop right there. That's enough to fill you full of joy. Man, God's with me. The mighty warrior who saves. Now watch this. He will take great delight in you. Do you know what that word delight literally means in the Hebrew language? You won't believe this. This is unbelievable. The word delight literally means to jump up and down. He is full of delight. Keep reading. He delights in you. In his love, he will no longer rebuke you. But now watch this. Will rejoice over you with singing. Anybody ever told you God sings? God sings. What does he sing about? Us. He is so full of joy that we have accepted Him, that we are in His family, that we love Him, that we worship Him. He is so full of joy, He sings over us. Listen, joy is not just something you get from God. Joy is something you catch from God. It's contagious. And the more you're filled with God, the more you'll be filled with joy. As a matter of fact, can I just be honest with you? You can be happy without God. You can't have joy without God. That's why Jesus goes on to say in the 16th chapter of John, verse 22, so with you, now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. Here's what Jesus said. Now, they didn't know what He was talking about. He said, look, yeah, I'm going to die, and for 3 days you're not going to see me, but I'm going to come back. And you're going to see me again like you've never seen me before. And when you do, two things are going to happen. Number one, He said, you will rejoice. Not you may, you will. He said, you can't even help from having joy. He says, as a matter of fact, once you meet me as the resurrected Lord, you can no more keep from joyful than the sun can keep from shining. You will rejoice. And then He says this. He said, and your joy will be permanent. Listen, He said, nobody can take away your joy. I mean, people who are determined to be joyful pay no attention to the weather, the days of the week, how old they are, the economy, the interest rates, deficits. They just are determined to be joyful. Now, as I kind of wrap all this up, let me just go back. I got to tell you one other thing, because otherwise this sermon will be incomplete. There is one thing that can rob you of your joy. If you're a follower of Jesus Christ, there is one thing. Matter of fact, let me make it stronger. It not only can rob you of your joy, it will rob you of your joy. It will suck all the joy out of you like a gigantic vacuum cleaner. Let me tell you what that is in case you don't know. It's not sorrow. Jesus already proven you can have sorrow and be full of joy. It's not sickness. Trust me, in my ministry, I've been around a lot of sick people who knew they were dying and knew they wouldn't get out of the hospital. They were full of joy. It's not sickness. It's not suffering. It's not sadness.